All right, we're going to read of Plymouth Plantation and we're going to answer the questions at the same time. Um, we are reading about Bradford, who came to the north. It says plantation, but it's really Plymouth Rock, where the Mayflowers landed. So it's in the north. And we are eventually going to try to hopefully see the difference between the American literature that comes from the South and American literature that comes from the North. And we're going to hopefully compare that to any of the Anglo literature we already looked at, maybe some of the African and Asian literature we already looked at, try to figure out what is American literature. That's our plan. All right. So while we read this, you're going to underline whichever way you want. You're going to mark it up whatever way you want. You can turn it in. And we're also going to answer these questions. First question says, during the voyage, where does Bradford see signs that God is directing the history of the pilgrims? And be sure to use the ICE method. If you use a quote, don't start with the quote. Make sure you introduce the quote first before you cite the quote. And then next one is, what examples did Bradford use to illustrate the perils of the journey? So let's start reading and see if we come across any of those answers. And this is going to be written in older language, so it may be a little awkward for you guys nowadays. Of their voyage and how they passed the sea, and of their safe arrival at Cape Cod, September 6th. These troubles being blown over and now all being compact together in one ship, they put to sea again with a prosperous wind, which continued divers days together, which was some encouragement unto them. Yet, according to the usual manner, many were afflicted with seasickness. Okay, so apparently we got caught up in the middle of the story and they're getting back on the ship and they're sailing around. And I may not omit here a special work of God's providence. There was a proud and very young, very profane young man, one of the seamen, of a lusty, able body, which made him the more haughty. He would always be contemning the poor people in their sickness, and cursing them daily with grievous excretations, and did not let to tell them that he hoped to help cast half of them overboard before they came to the journey's end. So there's some guy, one of the sailors, who's giving them all grief and cursing at him and saying, I wish I could throw you overboard before they came to the journey's end, and to make merry with what they had. And if he were by any gently reproved, he would curse and swear more bitterly. But it pleased God, before they came half seas over, to smite this young man with a grievous disease, of which he died in a desperate manner, and so was himself the first that was thrown overboard. Thus his curses light on his own head, and it was as astonishment to all his fellows, for they noted it must be just the hand of God upon him. So this is a Puritan, Bradford, believing in the Bible, reading the Bible a lot, and he believed that God came down and took care of this guy that troubled them. So Bradford does see signs of God directing the history of the pilgrims. There's already one sign right there. After they had enjoyed fair winds and weather for a season, they were encountered many times with crosswinds and met with many fierce storms, with which the ship was shroudly shaken, and her upper works made very leaky, and one of the main beams in the midships was bowed and cracked, which put in them some fear that the ship could not be able to perform the voyage. So some of the chief of the company, perceiving the mariners to fear the sufficiency of the ship, as appeared by their mutterings, they entered into serious consultation with the master and others officers of the ship, to consider in time of danger, and rather to return than to cast themselves into a desperate and inevitable peril. So they were talking about turning back, because the ship was broken. And truly there was great distraction and difference of opinion amongst the mariners themselves. Fain would they do what could be done for their wages' sake, being now near half the seas over, and on the other hand, they were loath to hazard their lives too desperately. But in examining of all opinions, the master and the others affirmed They knew the ship to be strong and firm under water, and for the buckling of the main beam there was a great iron screw the passengers brought out of Holland, which would raise the beam into its place. The which being done, the carpenter and master affirmed that with a post put under it, set firm in the lower deck, and the other ways bound, he would make it sufficient. Okay, so they jacked it up and they put a post underneath it, and they said, okay, we're going to make it. And as for the decks and upper works, they would caulk them as well as they could, and though with the working of the ship they might not keep long keep staunch, yet there would otherwise be no great danger if they did not overpress her with sails. So they committed themselves to the will of God and resolved to proceed. Okay, so they're coming halfway across the ocean and the ship is falling apart. They put it back together again and they keep going. In sundry of these storms the winds were so fierce and the sea so high as they could not bear a knot of sail, but were forced to hull for divers days together. And in one of them, as they thus lay at a hull in a mighty storm, a lusty young man called John Howland, coming upon some occasion above the gratings. Okay, before I turn the page, apparently the wind was so strong that they just tied the ships together and sat there in the middle of the ocean. Was with the seal of the ship thrown into the sea. But it pleased God that he caught hold of the topsail halyards which hung overboard, and ran out at a length. Yet he held his hold, though he was sundry fathoms under water, till he was hauled up by the same rope to the brim of the water, and then with a boat hook and other means got into the ship again, and his life saved. Okay, so some guy falls overboard, but he grabs onto some ropes, and they pull him over. So it pleased God that that happened. Although he was something ill with it yet he lived many years after and became a profitable member both in church and commonwealth. In all this voyage there died but one of the passengers, which was William Boughton, a youth servant to Samuel Fuller, when they drew near the coast. But I omit other things, that I may be brief. After a long beating at sea, they fell with that land which is called Cape Cod. Okay, so they finally arrive in the New World, the which being made, and certainly known be it, they were not a little joyful. After some deliberation had amongst themselves and with the master of the ship, they tacked about and resolved to stand for the southward. So they went back and forth and finally decided to go south, the wind and weather being fair, to find some place about Hudson's River for their habitation. But after they had sailed that course about half the day, they fell amongst dangerous shoals and roaring breakers, and they were so far entangled wherein they conceived themselves in great danger, and the wind shrinking upon withal, they resolved to bear up again for the Cape. So they went south for a while, but they came into shallow water and waves, and they decided to turn around and go back to the Cape, and thought themselves happy to get out of those dangers before night overtook them, as by good God's good providence. Okay, so there it is. God's taking care of them again. I'm going to go to the questions for a second. So we got the first question about God. Second question, examples Bradford uses of the perils of the journey. We certainly saw things about the boat falling apart and the crazy weather and the shoals. And now difficulties first settlers encountered from nature. That hasn't happened yet. And the next day they got into Cape Harbor, where they ride in safety. Being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element. But here I cannot but stay and make a pause, and stand half amazed at this poor people's present condition. And so I think will the reader too, when he well considers the same, being thus past the vast ocean, and a sea of troubles before in their preparation, as may be remembered by that which went before, they now they had now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather beaten bodies, no houses or much less towns to repair to seek for succor. It is recorded in Scripture as mercy to the apostle and his shipwrecked company that the barbarians showed them no small kindness in refreshing them. But these savage barbarians, when they met with them, after will later appear, were readier to fill their sides full of arrows than otherwise. And for the season, it was winter. Okay, so they land in the Cape, but there's nothing refreshing about it. There's no places to go. There's savage barbarians filling their sides with arrows. It's the middle of winter. It's cold, and they know that they they that know the winters of that country know them to be sharp and violent and subject to cruel and fierce storms, dangerous to travel to unknown places, much more to search an unknown coast. Besides, what could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men? And what multitudes there might be of them, they knew not. Neither could they, as it were, go up to the top of Pisgah to view from this wilderness a more goodly country to feed their hopes, for which may soever they turn their eyes, save upward to the heavens, they could have little solace or content in respect. Before I turn the page, um, we notice the difficulties the first settlers encountered: the weather, the wilderness, the wild beasts, the what he called savage barbarians. And then again, a reminder that as a European coming to a new country, they would use their European ideas to judge everybody. So they judged all the natives as savage because they weren't European. I'm going to keep going. For any outward objects, for summer being done, all things stand upon them with a weather-beaten face, and the whole country full of woods and thickets represented a wild and savage hue. If they looked behind them, there was the mighty ocean which they had passed, and now as a main bar and gulf to separate them from all civil parts of the world. If it be said they had a ship to succor them, it is true. But what heard they daily from the master and the company? Okay, so there was a ship there that could help them, but that with speed they should look out at a place with their shallop where they would be at some near distance, for the season was such he would not stir from thence till a safe harbor was discovered by them, where they would be, and he might go without danger, and that victuals consumed apace, but he must and would keep sufficient for themselves in their return. So he didn't give them any of their food, because he needed to save it for the trip back. So the guy on the boat didn't share the food. Yea, it was muttered by some that if they got not a place in time, they would turn them and their goods ashore and leave them. Let it also be considered what weak hopes of supply and succor they left behind them, that might bear up their minds in this sad condition and trials they were under, and they could not but be very small. It is true, indeed, the affections and love of their brethren at Leyden was cordial and entire towards them, but they had little power to help them or themselves, and how the case stood between them and the merchants at their coming away hath already been declared. Okay, so they left all their friends behind. They are now on the shore with no help. The people on the boat can't give them food. They need the food to return. Let's look at the questions again. What evidence does Bradford use to attribute their survival to God? Many mentions of that. What episode during that first desperate winter illustrates Puritans' concern for each other? How were they treated by the natives in the very early encounters? Okay, let's get to those questions. What could now sustain them but the Spirit of God and His grace? May not and ought not the children of these fathers rightly say, our fathers were Englishmen, which came over this great ocean, and were ready to perish in this wilderness? But they cried out unto the Lord, and he heard their voice, and he looked on their adversity. Let them therefore praise the Lord, because he is good, and his mercies endure forever. Yea, let them which have been redeemed of the Lord show how he hath delivered them from the hand of the oppressor. When they wandered in the desert wilderness out of way and found no city to dwell in, both hungry and thirsty, their soul was overwhelmed in them. Let them confess before the Lord his loving kindness and his wonderful works before the sons of men. So they're talking about God saving them. The starving time. But that which was most sad and lamentable was that in 2 or 3 months' time half of their company died, especially in January and February, being the depth of winter, and wanting houses and other companies, being infected with scurvy and other diseases which this long voyage and their inaccommodate condition had brought them. Scurvy is a vitamin C deficiency, and they eventually figured out that if you eat lemons and limes while you're sailing, you won't get scurvy. You'll have vitamin C. So as there died sometimes 2 or 3 of a day, the foresaid time, that of 100 odd persons, scarcely 50 remained. And of course, in the time of most distress, there was but 6 or 7 sound persons who, to their great commendations bespoking, spared no pains night or day, but with an abundance of toil and hazard of their own health, fetched them wood, made them fires, dressed them meat, made their beds, washed their loathsome clothes, clothed and unclothed them. So the people that were still healthy apparently took care of the people that were sick. In a word, did all the homely and necessary offices for them which dainty and queasy stomachs cannot endure to hear named, and all this willingly and cheerfully, without any grudging the least, showing therein their true love unto their friends and brethren, a rare example and worthy to be remembered. 2 of these 7 were Mr. William Brewster, their Reverend Elder, and Miles Standish, their captain and military commander, unto whom myself and many others were much beholden in our low and sick condition. And yet the Lord so upheld these persons as this general calamity, they were not at all infected either with sickness or lameness. So he says that God protected these people. And what I have said of these, I may say of many others who died in this general visitation, and others yet living, that whilst they had health, yea, or any strength continuing, they were not wanting to any that had in need of them. And I doubt not but their recompense is with the Lord. Okay, so they helped each other out, but I may not here pass by another remarkable passage not to be forgotten. As this calamity fell among the passengers that were to be left here to plant, and were hastened ashore, made to drink water, that the seamen might have more beer. Oh, so apparently the people on the boat, the sailors, still have beer to drink. And of course, beer not only would be alcoholic, but it would have a lot of calories in it. And it would have it would have some vitamins in it. It would actually be a food product in addition to alcohol. The seaman might have the beer, and one in his sickness desiring but a small can of beer, it was answered that if he were their own father, he should have none. The disease began to fall amongst them also, so as almost half of their company died before they went away. So it looks like the sailors also started getting sick, and many of their officers and lustiest men, as the boatswain, gunner, 3 quarters masters, the cook, and others, at which the master was something strucken, and sent to the sick ashore, and told the governor he could send for beer for them that need of it, though he drunk water homeward bound. But now, amongst his company, there was far another kind of carriage in this misery than amongst the passengers, for they that before had been boon companions in drinking and jollity in time of their health and welfare, began now to desert one another in this calamity. So the sailors, when they were getting sick, they were not helping each other, saying they would not hazard their lives for them. They should be infected by coming to help them in their cabins. And so, after they came to lie by it, would do little or nothing for them. But if they died, let them die. But such of the passengers as were yet aboard showed them what mercy they could. So here they are, the Puritan passengers are going to take care of the sailors, showing how much more they thought that they were behaving better than the sailors were. Let's look at the questions for a second. Okay, what episode during that first desperate winter illustrates the Puritans' concern for each other? Okay, the way they took care of each other. And then we're going to go, how were they treated by the natives? So let's see if we can get to that. They could, which made some of their hearts relent, as the boatswain and some others, who was a proud young man who would often curse and scoff at the passengers. But when he grew weak, they had a compassion on him and helped him. And then he confessed he did not deserve it at their hands. He had abused them in word and deed. Oh, saith he, you, I now see, show your love like Christians indeed one to another. But let one another lie and die like we let one another lie and die like dogs. Another lay cursing his wife, saying that if it had not been for her, he had never come on this unlucky voyage, and anon cursing his fellows, saying that he had done this and that for some of them. He had spent so much and so much amongst them, and they were now weary of him and did not help him, having need. Another gave his companion all he had if he died to help him in his weakness. He went and got a little spice and made him a mess of meat once or twice, and because he died not so soon as he expected, he went amongst his fellows and swore the rogue would cozen him. He would see him choked before he made him any more meat, and yet the poor fellow died before morning. Okay, so the sailors didn't do as good of a job taking care of each other as the Puritans did. Okay, now on to this question about how were they treated by the natives in their early encounters? In what ways did the natives and the settlers promise to help each other? All this while, the Indians came skulking about them. Notice the use of words. And would sometimes show themselves aloof off, but when any approached near them, they would run away. And once they stole away their tools where they had been at work and were gone to dinner. But about the 16th of March, a certain Indian came boldly amongst them and spoke to them in broken English, which they could well understand, but marveled at. At length they understood by discourse with him that he was not of these parts, but belonged to the eastern parts where some English ships came to fish, with whom he was acquainted and could name sundry of them by their names, amongst whom he had got his language. He became profitable to them in acquainting them with the many things concerning the state of the country in the eastern parts where he lived, which was afterwards profitable unto them, as also of the people there, of their names, number, and strength, of their situation and distance from this place, and who was chief amongst them. His name was, all right, so one guy can speak English, and he helped them out by telling them what's going on. His name was Samoset. He told them also of another Indian whose name was Squanto, a native of this place who had been in England and who could speak better English than himself. Being after some time of entertainment and gifts dismissed, a while after he came again, and five more with him, and they brought again all the tools that were stolen away before, and made way for the coming of their great sachem called Massasoit, who about 4 or 5 days after came with the chief of his friends and other attendants with the aforesaid Squanto, with whom, after friendly aid and entertainments and some gifts given with him, they made a peace with him, which have now continued this 24 years in these terms. Okay, so here are the terms of peace that they made: that neither he nor any of his should injure or hurt any of their people. Okay, so they made a deal that the native chief would not injure any of the European settlers. That if any of his did hurt to any of theirs, he should send the offender that they might punish him. So if a native hurt one of the Europeans, they would send him for punishment. That if anything were taken away from any of theirs, he should cause it to be restored, and they should do the like to his. If any did unjustly war against him, they would aid him. If any did war against them, he should aid them. Okay, so they'll support each other in times of war. He should send his neighbors' confederates to certify him this, that they might not wrong them, but might likewise comprised in the conditions of peace. Okay, so he send word to his neighbors that there's a peace deal. that when their men came to them, they should leave their bows and arrows behind them. I wonder whether the Europeans had to leave their guns behind. And one of the questions here, um, how were they treated by the natives in their early encounters? In what ways did the natives and the settlers promise to help each other? And then choose one of the peace terms. Were the peace terms more favorable to the settlers or the natives? Why? So you decide whether you think the natives got the better deal or the Europeans got the better deal. Or maybe it was just straight up fair. After these things, he returned to his place called Sowam, some 40 miles from this place, but Squanto continued with them and was their interpreter, and was a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond expectation. He directed them how to set their corn, where to take fish, and how to procure other commodities, and was also their pilot to bring them to unknown places for their profit, and never left them till he died. Okay, done. I'm going to turn off Screencastify.